the U.S. announced on Friday that it will be providing cluster munitions to Ukraine, a controversial weapon that is banned by over 100 countries around the world, including key U.S. allies like the UK and Germany. Now, the U.S. defended its decision on Friday to provide these cluster munitions to Ukraine, saying that it will be necessary in order to maintain Ukraine's ammunition stockpiles as it continues to prosecute its counteroffensive against Russia. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters that without tapping in to this stockpile of U.S. cluster munitions, Ukraine could run out of ammunition later this year. And it is not a scenario that the U.S. wants to see, where Ukraine runs out of artillery ammunition, given that it is so key in the war they are fighting against the Russians. Now, the U.S. is aware that allies had concerns about this. Many of them have banned these munitions because they potentially pose a risk to civilians, a long-term risk, because many of the little bomblets that these cluster munitions detonate, they actually fail to explode when they hit the ground. And that can pose a risk to civilians that is similar to the danger posed by landmines. But the U.S. says that the munitions that they will be providing to the Ukrainians will have a dud rate of lower than 3%, around 2.35%, and that is much lower than the dud rate of the cluster munitions currently being used by the Russians in Ukraine. The U.S. argument is that the Ukrainians will not use these to target civilian areas like the Russians have been, and that these cluster munitions will be used by Ukraine to help it defend its own territory rather than attack another sovereign country as Russia has been doing. But the U.S. has been trying to reassure allies behind the scenes that this is what Ukraine needs right now. And according to the National Security Advisor, U.S. allies have embraced that argument with open arms.
Joining me now is CNN military analyst and retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, good to have you.
Good to be with you, Victor. Good morning.
Good morning to you. So let's start here with two of the major concerns about sending these munitions. And I want to cite here an op-ed from former Senator Patrick Leahy and sitting Senator Jeff Merkley, in which they say this: sending cluster munitions to Ukraine would not only reverse decades of U.S. policy and practice, it would also kill more civilians and exacerbate the very problem we're seeking to address when we provide millions of dollars for ordnance clearance. And it would go against the 2/3 of NATO members and other allies and partners who are party to the convention and whose support is critical to our collective defense of Ukraine. The last thing we need to do is risk a rupture with key allies over a weapon that the United States should be leading the global effort to prohibit. So let's start first with the threat to life. Are U.S. munitions, these cluster munitions, any safer, less likely to create the duds than the Russian cluster munitions do?
They certainly are, Victor. And the key thing to remember is the so-called dud rate, which is basically the rate at which these munitions become unexploded ordnance. The dud rate for the U.S. weapons is much, much, much lower than the Russian dud rate. The Russian dud rate is somewhere around 30 to 40%. The U.S. dud rate is less than 5%, and they're advertising a rate of about 2.3 or so percent. Now, the dud rate will probably be higher on the U.S. side than advertised, but it will definitely not be as high as the Russian dud rate.
And those two senators, they point out in their op-ed in the Washington Post that there was a law passed that there can be no transmission or use of anything with a dud rate over 1%, and that would be unlawful. So we'll see. I guess there will be some way to know the dud rate of these. Does the transmission, the sending of these cluster munitions to Ukraine provoke further use of them by Russian military, or should that be a concern?
Well, the Russians are going to be using their cluster munitions regardless of what we do. So in one sense, when it comes to the law of proportionality, the Ukrainians are fully justified in using cluster munitions because the Russians are doing that. Now, that's not the White House argument. They specifically say, the National Security Advisor has specifically said that that is not the reason they're doing this. The main reason that this is happening, Victor, is because our defense industrial base, our weapons manufacturers, are not keeping pace with the standard artillery munitions production that is required for the Ukrainians to maintain not only their counteroffensive, but their ability to hold their positions that they have right now in both eastern and southern Ukraine. So this has basically become an issue of munitions shortages, and the very fact that we're having to grab into the cluster munitions bag, that indicates that we have other things that we have to fix in our defense industrial base, both in the United States and with our NATO partner nations.
Yeah, I was going to get to that later, but you've brought it up, so let's go to it now. I found that to be the most, I guess, jarring part of the snippet of the conversation the president had with Fareed that we saw a little earlier, was that he said that they're running low on ammunition, and supplying, from the U.S. perspective at least, is slowing a bit. What does that portend for next winter, spring, as we get deeper into this? Is this just a small short slowdown, or is this something that's going to be a challenge chronically?
I think it's going to be a chronic challenge, Victor, and this is something where we really have to think about how we produce weapons and the quantities in which we produce weapons. The one thing that we know about warfare is that it takes a lot longer than initially anticipated. That's almost always the case. The few exceptions in history, being, kind of remarkable incidents, and outliers in that sense. But the key thing about this is that our defense industrial base has not kept pace with the demands of the Russia-Ukraine war. And that should give us a lot of pause, not only for the current conflict, the one that Ukraine is in, but any type of future conflict that the United States or its NATO allies might find itself in. It also goes, of course, for Taiwan on the other side of the world.
Can we extrapolate from here? I mean, if the reason that these cluster munitions, which are controversial globally and even domestically, as I just read from these senators, the shortage of munitions for Ukraine is why we're sending these. What happens after that? I mean, if this is not going to change the trend in a war of attrition, is there a more controversial, or I'm not talking anything that's not conventional, but another weapon that we have to resort to at least keep the Ukrainians on an even field?
Well, beyond something terrible like a nuclear weapon, there's or a chemical weapon, which are both basically forbidden either by law or by practice. The real answer is not really. There are some weapons that are out there, some precision-guided munitions that could be used, and of course the Ukrainians have been asking for the ATACMS system, which generally uses conventional warheads to do its job, conventional rockets and missiles to do its job. So that's the kind of thing that will have to be done. The other thing, of course, is a bit of a longer term or medium term issue, and that is the provision of fighter jets for the Ukrainians, and that's where the talk of the F-16 comes in. So if you had provided the F-16 beforehand, perhaps we wouldn't be using cluster munitions in time. It's hard to say if that's actually would have actually been the case, but I think that is something to definitely look into and see whether or not the provision of F-16s and the ATACMS together would have prevented us from using cluster munitions as kind of this method of not quite last resort, but at least something as a stopgap at the moment.
Yeah, well, certainly the Ukrainians have been arguing that if we'd given as much military hardware as rhetoric, that maybe they'd be in a better position. Grateful as they are, they certainly wanted more earlier. Colonel Cedric Leighton, thank you so much.